You're a busy person who wants to learn languages. So here's how I, a busy person, manages their language learning. If you don't know who I am, I'm Varol, and I've currently learned Mandarin to an intermediate level and Spanish as a beginner. So, how do I manage all this? Well, I'm a busy student who has a university, I have a part-time job, I am a person who exercises, and finally, I'm a YouTuber. Sounds like a lot, correct? Well, 其实我每天能学习1-2个小时，但我放假的时候，你觉得我有更多时间能学习语言？但我放假的时候，其实我还在学习1-2个小时，所以我每天放假的时候到底在做什么？和上课的时候我做什么能让我学习1-2个小时？今天我可以教你怎么做。The first thing I'd like to ask you is, what are your goals with this language? I'm assuming for most of you, you want to get to a pretty high level, or maybe at least an intermediate level like my Mandarin, where you can understand most content and you could speak, but maybe with an accent. For those, I'd recommend that you try to follow all the things I'm talking about in this video. However, for other people who are more casual learners who just, let's say, want to learn a few phrases or impress their families, which isn't a bad goal, but many pieces of this advice you could still follow, but it probably is something you don't have to implement as much. So let's go start off with the first thing, which is the types of immersion. And before I start, immersion, what I would be talking about is not the type of immersion where you go fly to the country of your target language, live there, and then gain a language. That's something different. What type of immersion I'll be talking about will be getting listening and reading. So the first type of immersion would be called passive immersion. You may have heard it before, but let me explain it. Passive immersion is where you listen to something, but you're not giving it its full attention. And active immersion is where you sit down or maybe doing something else. But yes, almost all of your attention will be focused on the piece of content you'll be consuming, whether it be a book or a TV show. But I'll first talk about passive immersion. Passive immersion, I'd recommend, is because since we are busy people, we don't have a lot of time just to sit down, maybe even for an hour, to be able to watch content, because active immersion gives us the most benefits. However, don't underestimate passive immersion, as you can probably gain a lot more by just listening to something and doing some chores rather than just doing chores alone. The only thing I just recommend with passive learning is don't mistake it for something I've heard from other people called background immersion. This is something I've heard a YouTuber called Trenton and maybe Refold coin. So what is background immersion? Pretty much it's like passive immersion, but you give something very little attention and you're probably doing another task that requires a lot more of your attention. For instance, if I'm writing an essay, I'm not going to be trying to listen to Spanish at the same time because that Spanish is probably going to suck up some of my attention, and trying to do both things at the same time is going to be quite draining for me, you, and you're probably going to not get a good grade on the exam, and you're not going to get a lot from Spanish. So I just recommend passive immersion for tasks that require less mental energy. However, I'd still recommend doing passive immersion on times where you aren't as busy, when you're on school break or maybe you're on vacation. The reason being is because even though, yes, sitting around all day getting as much active immersion as possible is the best way to learn as quickly, I wouldn't recommend it because you'll be sacrificing a lot of other things in your life. And those other things in your life, like those healthy hobbies like exercising, getting enough sleep, can act like more like multipliers to your immersion rather than just being things that you think are not really as useful, because those things and the other parts of your life make a lot more of a difference than you think. So what I'd recommend is that if you're really not that busy and you can have spare a few hours of active immersion, then go for it. However, since we are busy people, I just like to say that just try to get as much passive immersion throughout little parts of your day where you realize that, oh, I'm probably not doing anything super important right now. Maybe I could just go listen to something while I'm doing the dishes or cooking a meal. But now let me go talk about active immersion, because without active immersion, we're pretty much not going to get any progress. Keep in mind as well is that the amount of value you can get from passive immersion is also dependent on your level in the language, which that level of the language is mostly dependent on how much active immersion you get. So since we're busy people, we really don't have a lot of time for active immersion. And with the times we do, it's honestly not a lot of days, so we can't keep it up. So here are some recommendations from me on how to enhance your active immersion. So some things I'd like to first talk about is the usual things like your environment. For instance, try to turn off your phone, put it on mute, put it in another room. That could be a really big distractor. Maybe if you can, you could go ask your parents and tell them, oh, just don't disturb me for a minute. I'll just go do my immersion. And you could also just try to find a quiet place and just really focus on the content. Try not to go into other tabs. It could really disrupt your focus, which is the main thing we're trying to do. Also, another thing for active immersion is that sometimes our ideal environment will not be there. So if you can find an opportunity to actively immerse as well, such as if you're in a cafe, or maybe if you're still eating in the food court or something, then you could also try to get some immersion as well. But I'd honestly at that point count that as passive immersion. Some other things I'd like to mention would also be some techniques that other people have done as well. 3 other components of immersion that really make or break it. The first one being density, as I mentioned. Let me go explain it first. Density in immersion is pretty much how much language comes in at a time. For instance, if you're going to read a novel, you're going to get a lot more language in you compared to just playing a video game with little to no dialogue. Let's say a Fortnite version of Chinese or something like that, where the only things you'll be getting language in is maybe getting killed and just saying, oh, you killed someone in Chinese, and then that's really all. Maybe just a couple voice lines that the characters say. That isn't really really dense compared to a novel where you gotta read all the characters' thoughts, their actions, how the author describes it, including all the dialogue. The next thing is also comprehensibility, which is how much you understand from it. Because if you understand nothing, not even say the general flow and gist of things, it's very likely you're just gonna have the same experience as getting gibberish. Which is also why if you're in a very low level, if you're watching this video, I recommend that you also combine this incomprehensible stuff what may seem at first incomprehensible input, you actually go compare with studies so that you can actually try to start noticing things as soon as you can. And lastly, which would be enjoyment. And do not underestimate the power of enjoyment, because enjoyment is more like a multiplier, just like the healthy habits that can help aid your immersion. With immersion itself, density and comprehensibility are the things that you should look for. But if you can, you should also really go for enjoyment, because enjoyment will really make you more hooked into the piece of content and will pretty much skyrocket, let's say, your engagement and focus a lot more than you think. There are many times where I try to just brute force something that I don't like, or really something I don't like, and although it does meet the other requirements of comprehensibility and density, and I just find myself just zoning out because of it. Although we should be still striving to go for harder content that does push our limits, you should also consider some factors of enjoyment so that you don't exactly divide your immersion progress rather than multiply it. But that's the main gist on how to get better active immersion. And one thing I'd also like to mention as well, as I mentioned earlier, is that you also should not neglect your life when doing active immersion. This is why I also recommend passive immersion a lot, which is because if you're going to be actively immersing all day, neglect all the other parts of your life, no exercise, no sleep, no talking with your family, it's really probably going to take a toll on stuff like your mental health. And if your mental health is bad, it's going to be a lot harder to focus on content, as you're more anxious, you're not able to have enough energy to concentrate. But yes, you get what I mean. And the last thing I'd like to mention today is scheduling and time management. And this is probably going to be something really boring, because you're either really good at this or you suck at this. And if you suck at this, don't continue watching this video until you've gotten like a piece of paper out or a device that you could type or write on, or like a tablet like this, because we're going to be making a timetable. So the first thing you want to do, well, with this is that you should try writing the times for the day, as you can see here. And the times should be like 6:30 wake up, 6:30, what was that? 6:30 wake up, 7 go to school, stuff like these. And the reason why I'm asking you to do this is because it's going to be really helpful for you for getting more immersion in. The whole reason why that I was able to immerse a lot more compared right now, I was able to still immerse at the same time. And in vacation, I was only immersing for like the same amount of time when I'm really busy right now. Just because I simply just had better time management and scheduling. Just being able to see the times where I'm able to like push in some passive and active immersion. Passive during the times it's like, oh, I'm right now going to cook, so maybe I could put in some passive immersion, or oh, I suddenly have so much free time, let me just active immerse instead of scrolling on TikTok or something. It's going to be really helpful for you. And if you really think that scheduling doesn't work for you, then that's honestly how I used to think as well. However, it really does help with your time. And a schedule isn't supposed to reflect something that it's the ideal day where, oh, I must get this amount of immersion each day. And then yes, you should also have a daily target for immersion. I also recommend that. You should also put that, let's say I want to immerse X amount of hours a day. You should also, yes, keep in mind that life does get in the way. Sometimes you won't follow your schedule really exactly. I might wake up a bit later, or let's say watch YouTube videos like this instead of trying to do what's on my schedule, and maybe an assignment takes a bit more time. Just pretty much these things is that you really shouldn't be discouraged by these, because what we're trying to create, like I said, is the ideal day. And if you're able to follow around 80% of it, I still count that as a win, especially if you're still a beginner and immersing is still painful for you. You don't have a lot of energy in order to immerse since it's really hard for you. Then having a schedule for immersion can really help you to stay consistent and eventually get to the point where immersion no longer feels like a chore and you'll be excited to do it every time. And that's honestly all I have to say. So the secret to really being able to learn a language as a busy person is a lot of time management and just knowing the times when you do have the time to learn a language, using that time effectively, let's say through more dense content, or being able to try to pick more content that's enjoyable for you. Also just having passive immersion throughout the day, so even when you're doing tasks that could boost your active immersion sessions, you're still getting a little bit of language here and there. And yes, we have a road to explore. 我们的旅程刚刚开始。